kind of tongue-in-cheek calling this presentation #meat. Talk a little bit about online conversations people are having about meat, particularly pork products. So to put this in context a little bit, lots of data about what consumers are thinking about food products, pork in particular. And you think about the evolution of our methods, maybe back up 50 years or so, we might have just asked people on the street what they thought about the product. And then we evolved a bit to asking surveys in a more systematic way, larger samples of people. We developed methods over the years of the types of questions we can ask that perhaps get a little bit closer to the retail environment, still surveys. In more recent years, we've been using scanner data to see what people are buying in grocery stores, actual data on purchase transactions. But the other data that's come about in more recent years is data on actual behaviors of consumers too. It's just behavior about what they're saying about products. And there's a whole set of data that we're swimming in online as people communicate on Twitter, Facebook, and whatnot. And that's the kind of data we're wanting to talk about today. Next slide. So my colleague, Dr. Nicole Widmar, she's been working in this space for the last several years using this sort of social media listening data. And she published this paper with some colleagues about earlier this year, and they were looking at what conversations consumers were having online in the aftermath of COVID-19. And so as I was talking to her about that work and other related work they had done, I said, Nicole, these are really interesting papers, but what about the next thing? And is there a way we can take this static academic paper and turn it into a dynamic tool so that we can look at something closer to real time and see what conversations people are having today about meat markets? And that led to the project I'm going to talk to you about today, the development of some online data dashboards. Next slide. So just for a little bit of background in terms of what we're doing, we're contracting with a company called NetBase that has collected, categorized online conversations in the major social media outlets: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, blogs, any comments that people put in blogs. All that data is captured, and we search through that data over a particular time period for our terms of interest. So in the case of pork, for example, we set up terms that we want to include that we're searching for, like #pork, hog, bacon, so forth and so on. We put a list here of over 100 words that try to capture what we're trying to measure, focusing on the production and eating side of the pork business. But then we got to exclude some terms, because you can imagine people search for things that aren't relevant to what we're interested in. So just think about hog wild or cartoons like Peppa Pig. Nothing to do with the consumption of the products we're interested in. So we have to put a whole set of exclusionary terms. We don't want to look at searches on those sorts of things, or things like people calling each other a name, like you're a pig. And so we exclude those, and there are certain sites that we exclude as well. So what do we measure at any point in time? Say a week is our unit of measurement. We can measure volume. So how many times is this concept mentioned in a week? The other thing we can measure is sentiment. Sentiment is measured by using some natural language processing. And what we're doing is looking at the words around, say, pork. And you want to see if those words are positive or negative. So if somebody says, I love pork, that would be very positive, like something close to a +100. If somebody says, I hate pork, that might be something negative, and something close to, say, a -100. And then you have all the gradations in between. So if somebody says, I like pork, that might be, say, a 50 versus 100. And you can think of all the other words and connotations that might be applied to words like pork or bacon or hog. And we put that on a scale of +100 to -100. Next slide. So this is our data dashboard. I've got a link there at the bottom of the screen. You can go there and play around with it yourself. It's a bit of a shame I had to submit slides, because what I would prefer to do is just play around on the dashboard with you. So these are screenshots from the dashboard. If you want to look at something different, just go to the website, click on it yourself. But I'm going to walk you through several screenshots of data you can get on this dashboard. So first, I'm going to lead up to pork, but I'm going to show you some other data on the dashboard first. First, these are social media conversations. So again, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that sort of thing. Right here, I'm showing you beef. The map in the middle is illustrating average sentiment in different states. The lines at the bottom are in gray are showing the trend in sentiment. The line that's in gold is the volume, the number of conversations. So for beef, in a given week, you can see there's between 1 and 2,000 mentions of beef in a given week. Overall sentiment, that's the left-hand side of the axis, which looks a little funky on this screenshot. But if you were to, on the real tool, if you were to hover over that with a mouse, it would tell you the exact numbers. It's on net positive. And you can see that in our map because it's all green. And the graphic you're looking at here is averaged over the last 3 years, 2020, 21, and 22. We'll do some finer breakdowns in just a moment. So overall, you can see beef sentiment is positive, most positive, and in the middle of the country there. Here's poultry, same setup as before. You can see the overall map of the United States is even more green. It means sentiment about poultry is even more positive than beef and even more widely shared. You can also see, looking at the bottom, there's again about 1,000 to 2,000 mentions of poultry, although the scale looks a little off because there was a big spike in volume of discussions about poultry in November of 2021. What was happening then, I'm not entirely sure, but big increase in conversations then. And the sentiment, you can see again, is overall fairly positive. Same graph here, but this is plant-based meat alternatives. Here, the map doesn't look quite so green. In fact, we got some red states there. So red means on net negative, more negative sentiment. So places like Mississippi, Wyoming, I believe that's Utah there, on net conversations surrounding alternative meat products are more negative than positive. They're most positive in states like California and New York. You can also see at the bottom graph, the number of mentions is just much, much lower. So again, that gold line is volume. You can see we're not, we're maybe 50 mentions per week of this kind of product. And sentiment is hovering right around 50. So not really positive, not really negative, kind of wiggles around a little bit. Okay, now we get into pork. So it's the same graph, but now applied to pork. You can see we have between 1,500 to 2,000 mentions of pork every week. On net across the country, mentions of pork are positive. There is some variation. Arkansas is consistently the most positive mentioned state. Some of that might have to do with the mascot of the leading university there at Arkansas. We try to, again, weed out some of those confounding mentions, but people in Arkansas are like to mention pork, and they mention it in a very positive way. But you can also see across the country, the good news is mentions of pork are positive. What you can also do in this tool is drill into any given state. So I'm sitting here in Indiana, so you can click with your mouse on Indiana. You can get the trends and the sentiment in just that state. It's hard to see because the screen is so small, but the net sentiment in Indiana is 32. So remember, that's a scale from -100 to +100. So mentions of pork in Indiana are positive, and but fairly small in terms of volume, but overall net positive conversations. If I just do a look at this just at pork, if you want to break down of the top states in terms of sentiment, I already mentioned Arkansas, but what are the next highest states in terms of where conversations are the most positive? It's Utah, Tennessee, Mississippi, Iowa, South Dakota, Kentucky, North Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Carolina. The next table over shows those states that have the lowest sentiment on average over this 3-year time period. So the lowest state is Montana, Idaho, followed by New York and New Mexico. The good news is, even in those states, the net sentiment is still positive, just less positive than it is in some of the other states that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. What about volume, just mentions? So here we put these on a per capita scale, or at least per 10,000 people scale, because if you didn't do that, then California, New York, Texas are going to be the most, just because there's more people there, you get more volume. So at least on a per person basis, again, Arkansas, not only is it positive, people like to talk about pork or pigs, or at least Razorbacks or something in that state, much more commonly than other places. But you can see here, it's not necessarily always positive. So there are more mentions in Massachusetts. You can also see California up there. Some of that may be to policy events that many of you are aware of, like Prop 12, that were in the news and people might have talked about there. The slide on the right, or the graph on the right, shows those states where there were the fewest number of conversations about pork. So West Virginia, Idaho, Utah are those states where there were fewer conversations about pork relative to some other locations. Okay, it might be useful. So I've been showing this 3-year time period, but this slide says, well, what about just the year 2020? So I went over and selected just the year 2020. You can see a little more variation. So Arkansas positive, but North and South Dakota, you can see showing up fairly positive. And now you can see in terms of the time trend, more pronounced events that happen. So look what happened in that June time period of 2020. Big increase in volume of discussions about pork and a big decrease in sentiment. In fact, sentiment went negative during that time period. Anybody remember what happened during that time period? Of course, that was a packing plant shutdowns. When a lot of discussions in the news about is it going to be enough pork, what's going to happen to the backlog of animals that were on the farm. All those sorts of conversations were mainly negative, and you can see that showing up here in the data. The good news is, at least in the data, by really by the end of that month, conversations had fallen back down, and the sentiment about conversations on pork had returned to positive and stayed positive for the rest of the year. Here's 2022, a little bit more volatility. Overall, again, sentiment is positive, but we do get a couple of spikes there in March, in May, late May, and then here more recently in towards the end of July. Sentiment again is overall positive, except for that period around the end of July, 1st of August, where sentiment went at least down to close to zero, so neither net positive or net negative. Honestly, I don't know what happened then. I've tried to do some searching to figure out exactly what those conversations were that caused a little bit of an uptick and that decrease in sentiment, but I haven't been able to identify a single cause. So if you know what it is, put it in the chat. I'd be anxious to hear what your insights are. What we can do, though, is on the tool, if you want to, you can hover over that exact date, that week, click on it, and it'll zoom in across the United States and show us what was happening on that week across the United States. Again, that particular week happened to be a negative sentiment week, particularly negative sentiment in Montana, Idaho, Vermont, Maine. Again, I'm not entirely sure what was happening then, but you can see the breakdown that happened there. Still good old Arkansas, still positive, net positive, even during that negative week. The other thing this tool allows you to do, there's another tab over on the left-hand side, and that is rather than doing social media listening, you can also just click on traditional news sources. So think CNN, Fox, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, your local news, and search across those. Those aren't separated by state because a lot of those are national publications. But you can see over the 3-year period from 2020 to 2022, the net sentiment in the news media, traditional news media, was a 27, so still overall positive. And you can see the trend that's there on the bottom that is similar to, but not exactly the same as the trends that we see on social media. So I'm going to end with this one. Play around with the data yourself. So go to our website, the center that I also direct, in addition to being the head of the department, I'm also directing the Center for Food Demand Analysis and Sustainability. So ag.purdue.edu/CFDAS. That'll get you to our main page. And then if you click on the dashboards tab, then scroll down to the very bottom, you can find the hashtag Meat Dashboard. That is the one I talked through today. If you're curious, we also have this tab that says survey results. We survey over 1,000 US food consumers every month, ask them a variety of questions, and we track some of that data that we have as well. So hopefully I have not creeped you out that we have been listening in on your social media conversations, but we are. It's another way to say whenever you're asked to check those terms and conditions, be careful what you're saying yes to, because you are saying yes to us and other people being able to see your data and track it and look at it over time. But hopefully we can use that data to help inform decision-making in industries like the pork industry. So I'll stop there. And next up on the agenda is Alton Calo, who's going to offer the most recent hogs and pigs report data.